Last Sunday was Bodhi Day, Rohatsu in Japanese, celebrated on the 8th day of the 12th month, and a group of our Sangha sat this year on Rohatsu, and that's a nice tradition and hopefully we'll continue it. But what are we doing? What are we doing when we sit a Japanese festival? Are we turning Japanese? There's the track, I looked it up from way back, The Vapors, 1980. Turning Japanese. I think I'm turning Japanese. I really think so. Is that what we're doing? What's our relationship as sitting in the UK or elsewhere in Europe or in the States? What's that relationship with Japan? It's complicated. Even Rohatsu itself is complicated. It's, as I said, the 8th day of the 12th month. Yeah, except that was always traditionally the 8th day of the 12th lunar month for a year which didn't actually begin on January the 1st in our sense. Obviously, like our Easter, Rohatsu moved about. When the Japanese adopted the Gregorian calendar as part of being modern, then they standardized the festival of Rohatsu as being the 8th day of the 12th month of the Gregorian year, which ends at the end of December. So even there's an interesting interaction between East and West. And of course other Buddhist traditions celebrate similar festivals. Rohatsu is the point at which we celebrate the Buddha's awakening. Many traditions celebrate Vesak or Wesak or some version of that, which often brings together the birth of the Buddha, the awakening of the Buddha, and the parinirvana, the passing of the Buddha in one festival. Sometimes they're celebrated separately. Vesak is normally in May. Again, that's partly the tradition of the rhythm of the Indian Buddhist year, according to the seasons. Long retreats, angos, are done in spring and autumn, and that kind of relates a bit to when Indian Buddhism had a long practice session during the rainy season, because literally you couldn't go anywhere because it was just too muddy. So you all came together and stayed in the same place and practiced together. So all of these are culturally very specific forms. And what's important here is that the culture, in the widest sense, a culture which is very different from ours, is it the specific forms, the actual way that you do it? Is it just important to have a way of doing it, to have some kind of form? Or is it something else we're looking at? So say even Japanese Rohatsu, when it's actually celebrated, influenced by the Japanese deciding at the end of the 19th century they were going to be modern. That was the only way to survive in what was becoming then the contemporary world, a world of American gunboats, international trade, the decline of China as the superpower of its day. But all of our Buddhist forms are actually, hybrid, mongrel. Zen we think of as Japanese. It came from the Chan of China. China was not the birthplace of Buddhism, and when Buddhism arrived, it existed in this uneasy equilibrium with Taoism and Confucianism. And it's easy to see those things, looking at it from way over here and way long into the future, of those as being very separate traditions. But of course, they hybridize. There's so much influence of both Taoism and Confucianism within Zen and the other Chinese forms of Buddhism. And probably in the West, we're more aware of the Taoist influence than the Confucian influence, because in a way, that actually interests us more. The waterway and this sense of something beyond, rather than filial piety and obeying your parents and the other kind of headline messages of the Confucian tradition. So, has all this hugely enriched the Buddhism that we practice as Zen, or is it a falling away from original purity? It gets argued in both directions. Again, in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, that's a hybrid between the Indian tradition of Buddhism, and Tibetan traditional shamanic culture. And the present form of the indigenous religion of Tibet, Bon, again, is hugely influenced by Buddhism, so it's complicated. And I think its major shamanic aspect of that tradition actually makes it quite problematic to practice in the West. Because, we take forces, we take powers, we take spirits very, very seriously. The kind of practices which are foreign to us in the West. Or perhaps that's the attraction. This is something we need to think about. And even in Japan, of course, Japan adopted a lot of Chinese beliefs, practices, material culture, because China was the superpower the whole medieval period in the Asia and Pacific region. Japan, in that sense, we can think of as being part of Greater China. It's the country with which one traded normally, and so influential. Buddhism, of course, came from China. And yet, of course, you also have this indigenous Japanese tradition, which is verging on the shamanic itself, the kami, the spirits of place, a tree, a waterfall, a valley. Now that gets developed and organised later on into Shinto, formal Japanese indigenous religion, not like this foreign Buddhism. Again, the Chinese had the same kind of conflicted attitude, shall we say. From time to time, Chinese emperors had enough of Buddhism, abolish all the monasteries, send the monks back to lay life. We're going to be Taoists or Confucians. And then, of course, 100 years later, the monasteries had reformed and so on. Similarly, the Japanese government has always had a very ambivalent attitude towards its Buddhism. And so you get these very complex interactions between indigenous beliefs, what the authorities think they want, and incoming Buddhist traditions. Again, is all this just making things more complex, more interesting, more creative, or is it a falling away? And of course, every Buddhist school that there has ever been has been absolutely 100% convinced that it is actually the real Buddhism, it's actually the true Buddhism, and that everybody else has diverged for some reason, even if the Buddhism was in effect only discovered by the founder of our tradition in whenever. And even in our own wonderful Soto tradition, our founder Dogen, Dogen famously says there's no need for sects in Buddhism. All this is ridiculous and irrelevant. Just practice Buddhism. Practice the way we practice, obviously. And this even continues into, some of the best teachers of the present day. Thich Nhat Hanh, wonderful, wonderful teacher. Very major part of his thinking about Buddhism was based on going back to the Pali Suttas and putting them alongside his own Zen and Pure Land practice, and very definitely thinking towards, what can we say the original Buddhism is? Very differently, you find a secular Buddhist like Stephen Batchelor, again looking back to the Pali Suttas. What was really going on here? What can we infer? And he's developed his own very interesting, very plausible, but who knows, account of the Buddha's Sangha, how it developed, the crises it went through during the Buddha's lifetime, and the very problematic situation towards the time of the Buddha's death. Fascinating stuff, but how do we know? What do we know? Even the dates of when the Buddha actually lived. The Theravada tradition, very strong, very continuous, but nothing written down for centuries, had its own dating. Modern scholars, of course, have cast an immense amount of doubt on that and have moved the time of the Buddha's life anything from 100 to 200 years forward. But in fact, we also know that the contemporary scholastic dating system is actually circular. It has no fixed points, no true reference points. So that's, again, a different form of plausible conjecture. We just don't know. But then, even if we could get back to what we think is the original, true form of the Buddha's practice, what would that even tell us in a contemporary context? Let's remember this once more, this favourite saying of Thich Nhat Hanh's. Buddhism is made up entirely of non-Buddhist elements. And this is literally true in the teaching of Shakyamuni. He worked with the materials to hand. Well, either you consider him as being effectively a being out of this world and of seeing and saying the truth in the only form that it could be said, or, and I don't think even to say this much has implications about, the status or nature of a Buddha or whatever, or he was working with the materials to hand, that amalgam of very fluid traditions and strands within Indian philosophy that was developing in the border of what is today northern India. And again, there's so much we don't know. A lot of those strands are part of the Vedic tradition that would eventually, and again, gets formalized as far as it is a formal system, into what we now think of as Hinduism. And in one sense, the formation of Hinduism as any kind of organized system was partially in response to, the very relatively organized nature of Buddhism, with which it was in major competition, and eventually, in these terms, winning and losing, won in India and lost in Ceylon. So we know that one of the principal themes of that tradition is of rebirth and the problematic nature of that in relation to any idea of self. It makes perfect sense in what we'll call the Hindu version. We are part of a greater something and we just spin round and spin round on the wheel of rebirth. It's more problematic for Buddhism because Buddhism takes anatman, no self, as its basis, but still the best account we have, and they may be true, they may be completely made up. The Pali Suttas very much deal in these terms. And of course, it may be that he was working with the idea of rebirth as the common understanding of how the world worked, how people worked. There's even a very interesting theory that what was actually happening here, this was the new idea, this was the new philosophy, this was the new science at this point. So of course he'd try and couch it, frame it in those terms. What's really going on? Well, to be honest, we don't know. Is this a problem for us? If it is, what kind of a problem is this for us? Does it even matter specifically what was believed or what was not believed? And are we under any kind of obligation? Are we failing if we don't believe what was believed? Can we break it out to belief entirely? And of course, at one level, what I'm saying about, working with the materials to hand, that was a very appealing notion to Western scholars. 18th, 19th, 20th century, when Buddhism began to be noticed in the West. In fact, there's even quite a good argument that, Buddhism as such didn't really exist until it was invented by the West, because it was lots of different traditions. And the West, being the West, has to make like a natural history of Buddhism and talk about relationships and put them all in the same big basket. Interesting. But where I was trying to go with this, and I'm sorry I get a little bit distracted, there's so much richness here, it can shoot off in any direction. Of course, for your modern, scientific, rational scholar interested in Buddhism, of course the Buddha was only talking in terms of rebirth, because that's what people believed. And had he been living in 19th century Britain, he would have undoubtedly thought in terms of the physics and chemistry of the day, without question. Which brings us back to a fundamental question of why we believe what we believe, and the very great extent to which we believe what we want to believe, what suits us, what we can make use of, and we can lean that a bit negatively. Well, of course, we're just foisting the prejudices of our own day. Or we can lean it positively. Yes, we're actually finding what within an existing tradition we can make use of, makes sense to us. Which are we doing at any given moment? Or can we begin to bracket out the whole notion of believing, not believing? Why do we believe things? And how does this relate to the question of why we practice? What brought us to Zen in the first place? My teacher, Barry Majid, one of his key ideas is curative fantasies. What in me is failing? What in me is lacking? What in me is incomplete? What in me hurts? What in me is causing me suffering? That's causing me to think that this weird activity of reading 2,000-year-old texts and sitting on your bum for half an hour, 2 hours every day, why on earth would I think that was an appropriate thing to do with my life? What specifically about me, and of course what specifically about us? Because we're, so many ways fundamentally similar. All different, but all in the same kind of boat. So these curative fantasies. That might lead us on to just thinking about fantasies more generally. And after all, this is the East we're talking about, the exotic East, where things are different. And of course, it's only in the past few decades that we've really begun to understand what the scholar Edward Said called Orientalism. That we look to the East for specific things because they're related to issues in our own culture. So the way in the 19th century, there's a certain kind of romantic interest in Buddhism because it seems the irrational in a world, the Western world, which is just becoming too rational. Or, at roughly the same time, there's a very rational interest in Buddhism because, we're still living in Christian mysticism and nonsense of saints and a guy who was God and not God and all this complexity. Buddhism's really rational and straightforward by comparison. And again, we find what we find what we can work with. The way that it might excite us for us repressed Westerners, the indulged and sexually explicit Orientals, the Kama Sutra, and it's important with the whole idea of the Kama Sutra that it's something else, it's something from elsewhere that can represent something for us. So in all these ways, this culture, this tradition, this practice, which is coming from somewhere other. But how other? And what's the importance of that? Particularly given that we're not separate. This other is not completely other, and yet it's not us either. And how do we work with that? Do we want it to be exotic and different and over there? Or actually, is it important that it is a bit exotic and different and over there, and that interests us, gets our curiosity, gets our yes? This business is about something more than what I can see here. And actually, this will mark that. The point about curative fantasies, as Barry talks about them, it's easy to think, oh yes, that's bad. I need to get rid of that. But if we didn't have those fantasies, we'd never start practice. We're not going to come to it cold as a purely rational activity or something. It's only the pain, it's only the confusion, it's only the sense of lack that brings us to practice. And for practice to attract us, we need to be able to engage our fantasies with it. And then we work through that as process. And we never entirely get out the other side, but our fantasies, our curative fantasies, develop and change, and we come to understand our place, our relationship. And one of the ways we do that, and this is quite interesting because this is where we actually belief maybe changes its importance a little bit, which is Zen in particular, but maybe Buddhism in general, is particularly about what we do with our bodies. There's the French philosopher Louis Althusser, who said, what makes you a Christian is not saying, I believe. What makes you a Christian is kneeling when the priest asks you to, is kneeling in front of the altar. That's actually what makes you a Christian. We might agree, we might disagree, but actually just think that through in our Zen terms. What actually makes you a Zeni, a Zenist, however we want to call it, is coming back to the cushion, is sitting, is having some kind of relationship with bowing, having some kind of relationship with chanting, not as a thing I completely understand, oh well, this is why I do that, but as an investigation, as a practice that develops over time, that we move through different understandings of. We may say, I believe this, we may say, I disbelieve that, but the continuity here is in the practice. And actually, this is where we have real continuity with a tradition of 2,500 years. People have been not necessarily buckwheat hull-filled cushions, but they've been sitting there, bums down, they've been walking, they've been chanting. And of course, it's not the same sitting, it's not quite the same, but it's still related to this body, and it's still a practice, and it's still part of that continuum. And in some ways, yeah, okay, that's actually the heart of our practice. Repeat, come back, return, repeat, come back, return. And so it's interesting that our tradition comes from somewhere else, and that it comes from somewhere else and we have a different kind of ongoing and evolving relationship with it. I want to say curry here because The English are very keen on curry. And of course it comes from somewhere else. India. The Raj was invented by white men in India or whatever. And it's to do with migration to this and so many complex things. And hopefully our involvement maybe with our practice goes a bit deeper than that. But that's a fascinating relationship between same and other, and this and the exotic. Not separate, and not knowing, not finished, not this is the way to do it, this is the way it's always been done, or oh no, now we do it this way. But not knowing, investigating, bringing this body back again and again to realize that we are not separate from Dogen, not separate from the Chinese who brought Buddhism from India, not separate from the Buddha's original Sangha, but we're not the same either. Not knowing, not separate.